Hello, welcome back. The boss of the Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has been declared dead by the Russian authorities after a plane he was thought to be travelling on crashed north of Moscow. It comes just 2 months after he led a failed coup against the country's military leaders. Well, dramatic footage captured the moment the jet fell from the sky and crashed into the ground. 10 people are said to have been killed. Well, over the next half an hour, we'll be speaking to Sky correspondents and experts for their insight and analysis on these latest developments. Here in the studio, I'm joined by our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, and the former Air Vice Marshal and military analyst, Sean Bell. And from central London, the security and defence analyst, Professor Michael Clark. And from St. Petersburg, Sky's Moscow correspondent, Diana Magnay. First, though, let's speak to the former Russian Prime Minister from 2000 to 2004, Mikhail Kazyanov. A very good afternoon to you. Thanks so much for talking to us. First of all, what's your reaction to the news coming out of Russia? And do you have any doubt that Yevgeny Prigozhin is dead?
I have no doubt he's dead, and this death was inevitable. It was clear just in the very beginning on that day when his mutiny failed and all these relations with Mr. Putin was broken. And in fact, it is absolutely clear. I know that Mr. Putin is not capable to forgive. And that I thought that Prigozhin would be killed somewhere in Africa or somewhere else. But this is very, I would say, the way of killing him is very dramatic and very just impressive. And I'm sure no one of Russian officials would start even doubting and or have a long discussion on that. Just as it's demonstration by Mr. Putin for everyone in Russia.
So you believe that President Putin was behind this. What message do you think he wants to send out?
I have no doubt that Mr. Putin is behind this. And I think the main message is for every official and ruling elite, so that the traitors, Putin already called, and that days, 2 months ago, he named already Prigozhin as a traitor. And now that is a demonstration for everyone that every traitor would be killed in a different way. In any of ways just possible, either Novichok or even an aircraft crash.
And where do you think this leaves President Putin? Do you believe he's strengthened by this?
He is not strengthened by this. He demonstrates his power and control and his anger to control and demonstrates and give a signal to everyone. So they have to perform properly. And there should be no doubt about any, I would say, not fulfillment of his orders, because just Prigozhin mutiny demonstrated Putin's weakness. And now Putin just had to create some kind of strength, and he believes that's the strength, and that's why he is no shying that this way could be possible to kill the traitor, and his understanding. And I think just no one, in ruling elite, no one is doubting that who was behind this death.
Well, Mikhail Kazyanov, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We appreciate it. Thank you. So let's turn to our correspondents and experts and go into this a little bit further. Diana Magnay, our Moscow correspondent, you're in St. Petersburg at the moment. Tell us a little bit about how much coverage there is there about this crash and what's the reaction been to it in that country?
Well, I suppose on the state channels it is covered, but it's covered fairly straight. And it's not necessarily the top story. I read an interesting editorial in one of the pro-Kremlin tabloids today saying the Kremlin will blame the West will blame the Kremlin, the people will believe what the Kremlin tells them. So far, the Kremlin has been remarkably silent, and I don't think they're going to be saying very much, as we just heard from Michael Kazyanov. This is a very strong signal. Vladimir Putin doesn't really need to say very much. He's given the message that traitors will not be tolerated, and he appears to have acted on it. I was just at the Wagner headquarters, which is, it's not really the Wagner headquarters of the mercenary group, but it was opened in November as a IT hub for everything sort of military defense technology. And there is a memorial there where people all the way through the morning were coming and laying flowers in memory of Yevgeny Prigozhin, many of them in tears. Some of them had lost their sons at the battle for Bakhmut. You know, it showed here in St. Petersburg, which is Prigozhin's hometown, that there are a lot of people who supported him. And I think that was something that Vladimir Putin had to manage very carefully in the aftermath of the mutiny, because it wasn't just Wagner troops who felt that Prigozhin was a leader of men who came down and defended their interests, demanding more ammunition, more support for them. But also he had quite a lot of support in the rank and file of the army. That needed to be carefully managed. And I wonder if the Kremlin feels that by now they have managed to dispel any possible threat from those who supported him, and that this was therefore a time to act, with the disclaimer, obviously, that this could have been a freakish accident. We don't know what happened on that plane, and we probably never will.
Well, yes, and Sean Bell, let's pick up on that. What do we know about this crash? Can we draw any definitive conclusions from the footage that we've seen?
I think the footage is quite illuminating because there's loads we don't know, but the one thing we do know, he was travelling on a private aircraft that Yevgeny Prigozhin actually owned. There were 10 people on the manifest, 3 of those were crew, 7 of which were passengers, which included Yevgeny Prigozhin. And the video footage, I think, is quite illuminating, mainly because it's quite difficult to doctor the footage in the time available. And when you look at it from a purely analytical perspective, there's 4 things that jump to mind, one of which is very early in the footage. There's a little swirl of smoke, which is either indicative of a surface-to-air missile. From my days fighting with these jets, you were always looking for those little twirls of smoke, or that's some sort of explosion. The second thing that's indicative is on the way down, the wreckage is spewing smoke, but it actually looks more too light for smoke, and almost certainly, therefore, is fuel, and it's venting at a huge rate, which indicates that there's a massive, some sort of massive catastrophe of the aircraft. Near the ground, there's footage of the aircraft that appears to only have 1 wing, and therefore that would explain why it was actually falling like a sycamore leaf. And fourthly, the wing is actually fallen separate to the main wreckage of the thing. Now, the explanation for that could either be an internal explosion or it could be a missile system. Either way, we don't know. But from a purely military perspective, I'd suspect a missile system was most likely.
So, Dominic, we don't know the hard facts on this, but how likely is it that Yevgeny Prigozhin is dead and that President Putin was behind it?
I think that's all. That is the most likely explanation. We will never have hard facts, so we have to make assumptions. And I think if we go back to the day of the coup that Prigozhin launched, one of the most striking images of that day was this plane that his mercenaries shot down. Looked very similar to what we saw yesterday. It was hit. It wasn't a fighter jet, it was a bigger plane, and it kind of plummeted from the sky. And there's a kind of grisly symmetry between that memory and what we saw yesterday. And it was one of the most sort of striking images of the day, because it kind of really undermined the whole sense of the Russian government and the Putin regime. So there may have been an attempt to create this sort of theatrical spectacle to sort of settle that score, a man who lived by the sword and the missile dying by the missile. There's just no one else who could have had the capability and the means to do this and the motive. And any Russian who wanted to do this within the regime would have had Putin's support. So he almost certainly was behind this. And it is, you know, for a man who was called Putin's chef, revenge was best served cold, it seems, at a few thousand feet. The reason he's waited 2 months, though, is probably best explained by the fact that he could not have struck 2 months ago. He couldn't have done this 2 months ago. He had to undermine, dismantle and weaken the Wagner group. He's managed to do that not just back home, but also in Africa using Russian military intelligence. So we're now at the point where he was able to strike, and he did this in a very theatrical way, which sends an unequivocal message to the elites in Moscow and Russia, which is, I think, the key point about this, which is treason is not tolerated, traitors will be punished.
And Michael Clark, are you surprised that we're talking today about the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin? This was a man who was once a close ally of President Putin and had played a key role in his operation in Ukraine.
Yes, he did. And I think Prigozhin probably overestimated his closeness to Putin, because Prigozhin set himself up directly in opposition to Shoigu, the defense minister. And he may have calculated that if Putin was forced to choose, he would choose him, Prigozhin, instead of Shoigu, but he hasn't. Putin has obviously chosen Shoigu, who is very close to. They are personal friends in a way that Prigozhin was not a personal friend of Putin, even though he knew him for many years. And the fact is that Prigozhin overstepped the line some time ago. I mean, many months ago, when he started to criticize the Ministry of Defense in obscene terms, and he let his troops use the most violent language about the official staff of the Russian Ministry of Defense. And then Prigozhin seemed to get to the point where, as the MOD was moving against him, saying that, look, your Wagner fighters have got to become part of the regular Russian forces, that seems to have provoked Prigozhin to say, OK, well, this is a me or him sort of moment. And that led to this rather absurd situation on the 23rd, 24th of June, when the Wagner fighters moved into Rostov, as it were, occupied Rostov, and then from there set out on this march to Moscow, which then ended in agreement for them to be airlifted to Belarus and to call the whole thing off. And Prigozhin got clean away with it. In a way, he was riding a tiger by then. He'd overstepped the mark. He'd run a military rebellion. He hadn't been punished for it immediately. And in a way, he was carrying on, thinking, maybe believing, that somehow he was immune from the influence of Putin.
Okay, Michael, thank you. Thanks to all of you for the moment. We're going to come back to you shortly, but first let's take a short break. Do stay with us. We'll have more expert analysis on the crash, and I'll be speaking with Igor Novikov, a former foreign policy advisor to the president of Ukraine.
Do you know what kind of pollen gets up your nose? Sky News Pollen Reports. Brought to you by the Kleenex Your Pollen Pal app.
It'll be another warm afternoon in the south, but perhaps not quite as warm as yesterday, with more cloud around. There'll be a scattering of showers widespread across the breezy northwest and thundery in the southeast. Those storms should clear to the coast by the evening, and the rest of England and Wales will turn drier and brighter later too. Scotland and Northern Ireland will keep the risk of showers, where the pollen count will be low. Elsewhere, expect moderate levels overall, rising to high for central England.
Sky News Pollen Reports, brought to you by the Kleenex Your Pollen Pal app.
I think it's the word that Mary Earps herself used, isn't it? It's hurtful. And she was clearly very upset about it, and even went so far as to offer to put her own cash into funding the availability of a shirt so that female fans, and indeed all fans, could support our Lionesses, support her. And I think it's a huge commercial mistake by Nike, and really sad that we knew about this before the tournament started. We're now hearing that they're going to try to find a solution before the next tournament. It's just not good enough, really, is it? There's reputational damage, there's commercial damage to them. They would have made huge sales on an Earp shirt. I think it's a gamble for Nike, isn't it? They didn't know at the start of the tournament whether Mary Earps would be the heroine or the villain. Turned out that she was the goalkeeper of the tournament, in addition to being FIFA's Female Goalkeeper of the Year earlier this year. So look, they clearly took a decision, turned out badly for them. But as you say, we're all still talking about it, and hopefully they will make a change and recognise that our goalie was the person that helped get us through to the final. Look, I think there are some real questions about how women are treated in sport in general. I think there are lots of problems around the kit they're expected to use, which is in many cases just scaled down men's kit, not recognising the different features of female bodies. So look, I think there are wider discussions to be had, but what I want to see is some recognition from Nike that this was a mistake and change for the future. Nike do have form for it. What I think is quite interesting is that they've recently released an advert for a sports bra, and most of the comments underneath that are actually about, we'll buy this when it's got a number 1 and Earps on the back of it. I think that Nike need to be thinking very carefully about the commercial decisions that they make.
Welcome back to our special programme on a plane crash which, according to Russian authorities, has killed the boss of the Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, just 2 months after he led a failed coup against the country's military leaders. Well, we'll be getting more from our correspondents and experts shortly, but first let's speak with Igor Novikov, who's a former foreign policy advisor to the President of Ukraine. A very good afternoon to you. Thanks for talking to us today. What is your reaction to this news out of Russia?
Well, I'm not surprised at all. I actually made the bet with my literary agent about a couple of months ago after Prigozhin's coup, or whatever that was, that he's not going to survive until the end of the year. And, you know, it's obviously not unexpected what happened. Now, I would also add that we could expect a few more people to follow him in the coming months, because it seems like President Putin is paranoid.
So you believe that President Putin is behind this?
Yes.
And why?
He's the only one with motive and actually physical expertise to do that. It happened in Russia. You know, Prigozhin was being very public. You know, there's rumors that he was planning to relaunch his media empire, which he closed down after the failed coup. So it's blatantly obvious.
And what does this mean then for the war in Ukraine?
Well, it doesn't change much, because after the so-called coup, the Wagner group has been withdrawn and replaced with, you know, other cannon fodder, because Russia has plenty of that. But at the same time, for Russia, it means two things: stability and instability at the same time. Stability, because Putin will be trying to tighten all the screws and to solidify that vertical control of the country. Instability, because, you know, we have to remember that, you know, Prigozhin's empire was huge, and therefore there are a lot of people who lose out on a lot because of his death. Plus, he was a very public figure. He was loved by the Russians. Tells you a lot about the country. But you know, now he's gone. So let's see what happens next.
Well, yes. And how would you sum up the impact that Prigozhin had on Ukraine?
Well, he changed the course of the war. He made it way more difficult for Ukraine, because unlike the regular forces, the Wagner group are made up of mercenaries on one hand, with a lot of battle experience, and at the same time with a lot of cannon fodder, because, you know, up to 50,000 prisoners have been released and sent to the front lines. So that way he's made life a lot more difficult for Ukraine. And regardless of the outcome, you know, his death is welcome news, because, you know, he's a murderer.
Well, Igor Novikov, former foreign policy advisor to the President of Ukraine, we appreciate your time. Thanks so much. Well, let's rejoin our correspondents and experts now. And Michael Clark, I want to turn to you next. So what's your view on this? What impact do you think this could have on the war in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, not a direct impact, because the Wagner group had already withdrawn from the Ukrainian front itself, even though when they were fighting, they made up about 25% of all those forces who were actually fighting, not 25% of the total number of Russians, but 25% of those on the front line fighting on a daily basis. So the benefit of having Wagner groups withdrawn for Ukraine has already been felt, because they withdrew a couple of months ago. The broader benefits are that this is increasing the dysfunction within the Russian military, because the VDV, the airborne forces, were quite close to Wagner, because a lot of them used to be in the airborne forces, and they trained together at the Molkino base. They almost shared that base pretty well. The GRU, the military intelligence, are close to Wagner. So what has been happening to Wagner and what's happened to Prigozhin doesn't go down well with other bits of the command structure within the Russian military. And then this general sense of dysfunction at the top, that Putin is presiding over a state which is such a gangster state, you never really know what's going to happen next. So in the longer term, Ukraine will benefit from this. But day to day, this doesn't make any difference, really, to the sort of the offensive they've been conducting for the last 2 or 3 months.
And Diane Magnay, what's your take on this? Where do you think this leaves President Putin?
Well, I think it's, you know, for 2 months now we've been talking about how he looked fatally weakened from that mutiny, and why on earth hadn't he acted? And it appears as though he had. And we just heard from Igor Novikov that he imagines he'll be tightening the screws. I mean, he's done quite a lot of tightening of those screws already. We've seen Igor Girkin, who was a a famous military commander in Donbass in 2014 and 2015, Russian, and very outspoken on Russian Telegram over the last year and a half of this war. He has been jailed because of the criticisms that he launched directly against Vladimir Putin. He was jailed in the last few weeks. We've also, in the last few days, heard that General Surovikin, who was close to Yevgeny Prigozhin and acted as a kind of bridge between him and the Russian armed forces. Surovikin controlled the aerospace division, that he's been relieved of his duties. He vanished after the mutiny, and we believe that he was under house arrest or in detention somewhere. Now he's been relieved of his duties. No one has seen him. And now we have this happening to Prigozhin. And let's not forget what's happened to those on the more liberal side of the spectrum. Alexei Navalny just sentenced to another 19 years in prison. So I think the message is very clear. And it's one of those extraordinary things about Russia that on the one hand, the Kremlin's modus operandi is nothing to see here, business as usual, everyone carrying about their day-to-day. The war is far away. Don't worry, it's not affecting you. And then never to get lulled into a false sense of security, which is probably what Yevgeny Prigozhin had done over the last 2 weeks, because we saw him popping up more and more, smiling here in St. Petersburg at the Russia-Africa summit, suddenly appearing in Africa, talking about how he would continue to fight Russia's corner for it and make Africa even more free, he said in a video posted earlier this week. And yet, even he has had his comeuppance.
Yes, and that it also begs the question, what next for the Wagner Group more generally, Dominic, doesn't it? I mean, as hinted at there by Diana, they have a lot of interest in Africa, for example. What does this mean for the group as a whole?
Yeah, so the Wagner Group is not really a company like a kind of Western security corporation. It is a network of ex-special forces, ex-criminals, gangsters, ne'er-do-wells. And what really held it together and commanded it was Prigozhin at the top, who brought a kind of charisma and mystique. And it became extremely wealthy because the deal it did in Africa with numerous dictators was if they didn't want to play by the Washington rules, they would provide the muscle to these dictators, and in return they would get very lucrative minerals concessions. And for them, Prigozhin was the main figurehead who dealt with those leaders. But that wealth didn't give them full independence. They were always a kind of branch of the Russian government in the sense that they relied on heavy weapons, relied on missiles, they relied on Putin's patronage. They gave Putin a kind of ability to operate with a sense of deniability. So that was in Syria, in Africa, but also in Russia. So they were kind of doing his dirty work for him, and he was able to deny there anything to do with him when it was convenient. Now, what's happened to them the last couple of months is they have been weakened and undermined, and the Russian military intelligence in particular in Africa has been saying to those leaders there, forget about Wagner, we're the guys you talk to now. So they've become much more weak and effectively dismantled in some senses in various parts of the world. So effectively they're kind of coming to fizzling out in terms of their power and influence already. The fact that Prigozhin has gone is obviously going to accentuate that, accelerate that. We're going to have a statement from them, we're told. Today it's unclear who that will come from. But the network is being dismantled and Putin is re-establishing his authority over an organisation he had patronage over anyway.
And your views, Sean, on the future of the Wagner Group and Putin trying to demonstrate that he's a strong man, will he have achieved that aim?
One of the fascinating things is Yevgeny Prigozhin was a beast that was invented and generated by President Putin. Putin has needed mercenary forces, exactly as Dominic says, out in Africa, but also increasingly in the war in Ukraine. When he was fighting for Bakhmut, they were losing a lot of conventional soldiers, weren't making progress. His old friend, Yevgeny Prigozhin, brought in a load of convicts and fought that battle for him. But of course, all of a sudden, there was an inflection point then where Yevgeny Prigozhin got out too big for his boots, started to turn against his master, and all of a sudden, he had to be dealt with. And I think part of this is a certain symmetry about it, that President Putin will have needed the support of the Wagner Group. It's the only group that's provided military success on the battlefield in the last year. Now he's had to get rid of them. What does the future hold? Yes, in the short term, it looks powerful to get rid of him. But if you look at this from a week in the life of President Putin, we've had the BRICS getting together where the only person who wasn't there in person was President Putin. We've had the moon landings where Russian aircraft crashed, whereas the Indian aircraft landed. We've had the battlefields where no longer is the Wagner force fighting. Russia's on the back foot. Missiles are raining down on Moscow. And now, only today, we've been hearing about Crimea. Yes, he may have done one action by dealing with the problem, his beast that he invented, but actually things are not going well for President Putin.
Very briefly, Diana Magnay, are we likely to hear from President Putin on this issue in the next day or so?
I mean, we might get some kind of aside comment. I'm sure at some point he'll be drawn on it, but I don't think he feels that he has to say very much. We've heard from him already on the BRICS summit. I think he will try to distance himself from something like this, which he'll claim is simply a plane crash and investigators are doing their business. We'll have to see.
We will have to see. Diana Magnay there in St Petersburg, thanks very much indeed. Thanks to Professor Michael Clark, Dominic Waghorn and Sean Bell for all your expertise. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, there'll be showers around over the next few days, with thundery downpours threatening the southeast today. It'll be another warm afternoon in the south, but perhaps not quite as warm as yesterday, with more cloud around. There'll be a scattering of showers widespread across the breezy northwest and thundery in the southeast. The extent of thunderstorms across southeast England is a little uncertain, but they should clear to the coast later. There'll be increasing amounts of sunshine across the rest of England and Wales too, with some isolated showers fading away. Elsewhere, expect a mixture of sunny spells and showers into the evening, but central and southern parts of Ireland do look quite fine.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
You're watching Sky News. Do stay with us. Coming up, plenty more coverage on the apparent death of the Wagner mercenary leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Stay tuned.